Hey there! Virtual reality gaming was at one point considered the future. Actually being in the game, holding your weapon, feeling the ground beneath your feet sounded like the most awesome thing imaginable. And with current technology, we are as close to it as ever before. So how come VR is basically dead in the water now? To answer all this, let us first take a look at the history of virtual reality. Virtual reality itself is a broad term. And while the first idea for VR goes back as early as 1838, the first functioning VR headset that works similar as we know it today was created in 1968. Ivan Sutherland and his student Bob Sproul created the Sword of Damocles. And while it may look like a torture device, it is actually the first prototype of what we'd come to call a virtual reality headset. It was hung from the ceiling due to its weight and allowed you to look around computer-generated environments, albeit they were very primitive. From this point forward, virtual reality went through many iterations. The first VR headset to be sold commercially was the iPhone in the mid-1980s. It was actually able to track your head movements. It could only run a maximum of 6 frames per second though. And if you wanted to get yourself the iPhone plus the computers needed to run it at the time, it would have cost you around $250,000. Suffice to say that VR was not yet ready for a wider audience. The first affordable at-home virtual reality headsets came around in the early 2010s. It started with Oculus launching its Kickstarter in 2012. If you've been on YouTube for a while, you may remember videos popping up of huge YouTubers playing the first few games on the Oculus Rift headset. I remember being a kid and having it be my life's goal to own a VR headset one day. It would only be a few years until more headsets released that would launch what many may call the golden era of VR gaming. Every company tried to get their hands in on this growing market that they considered the future. Game studios went out of their way to add some sort of VR capability to their games. Indie companies were thriving off of their VR releases. And if you owned a VR headset, you were the coolest kid in the neighborhood. It was the gold rush of VR, a gold rush that would quickly fade as the market of VR players stopped growing. There was and is still a very obvious problem with VR gaming, which is that it's fairly expensive to buy in. Especially back then, you'd usually require a headset, controllers and at least 2 tracking stations, which would cost you anywhere between $600 to over $1,000 depending on which headset you were choosing for yourself. Such a huge investment for what were essentially a slew of tech demos was a lot to ask for, but it was interesting enough to cause an initial surge in sales. It became evident rather quickly though that the market share was not gonna grow to a large enough portion to be worth it for game companies to invest in. Skipping to today, the percentage of Steam users who own a VR headset is just slightly below 2%, with a potential few more percent of total gamers owning one if you count in meta users who don't have a Steam account, of which we are simply missing the data. So if you are a game studio which's only goal is to make money, are you gonna focus on the 2% of players or the other 98%? Contrary to what most politicians would choose, the answer here is pretty obvious. Thus, after the initial gold rush that peaked somewhere around late 2017, early 2018, what followed was a drought of VR games, which then fed into a vicious cycle. No VR games means less incentives to buy a VR headset, meaning less people buy VR headsets, meaning less incentives to make VR games for game studios, meaning less VR games, so on and so forth. Come 2019, VR gaming was the land of indie developers. People who were truly just passionate about their VR projects and wanted to make a great product, and that of furries in VR chat. While it didn't look like it would take over the market, it had made itself comfortable as a pocket in the gaming scene, with an uncertain future ahead of it, that is until a certain game released. Half-Life Alyx set out to change VR forever. It released as the flagship title of Valve's own VR headset, the Valve Index. Valve was looking to revive the VR scene with a bang, and create a bang they did. Half-Life Alyx released in early 2020 to great reviews. It was the first AAA VR first-person shooter story game, and it really lived up to that AAA title, as in, it was good. Remember when AAA games used to be good? That's for another video. At this point you may be asking yourself how a good VR game releasing could hurt the VR scene. And to be fair, that is a valid question. And before I get into it, the following will be me speculating. I'm not trying to definitively claim that Half-Life Alyx killed VR, I hope that's clear. To explain how this release may have hurt the VR scene, I'm gonna have to explain everything that makes Half-Life Alyx stand out and how it came to be. On the surface level, Half-Life Alyx is like any other Half-Life game. You fight through environments while solving puzzles and the story unfolds around you. But this game is far from just playing Half-Life 2 with a VR headset on. What you need to know about Valve is that they are truly special in the advantage they have over every other game studio. While other companies rely on video game sales to make their buck, and a singular flop could be enough to bankrupt the company, Valve works off the back of an infinite pile of money that is both Steam and children gambling in Counter-Strike. Valve can spend as long as they want making video games, which means that they have the time to truly iron out each small complaint about the games before releasing them. This involves each of the games going through vigorous, and I mean truly vigorous, amounts of playtesting. Playtesting doesn't necessarily require an infinite amount of money, so please do blame AAA studios for making bad, obviously untested games.
Is this game worth it? Does that answer your question?
But in the case of Half-Life Alyx, it is fair to note that we are talking about such a huge advantage that Valve had. The first VR Half-Life projects began development at Valve in the mid-2010s, basically right around when VR headsets were first being sold. And they have been refining ever since. This was even before the gold rush era of VR. It is through all these years developing that they learned everything that makes VR gaming great and everything that could make it awful. They learned that reaching down to pick up items is not fun, which is why they introduced the gravity gloves. They learned how environments and scale works in VR and how to properly set up arenas to have the player fight through. They learned of things players fear in VR and played into those. They made an art style that is somehow both cartoony and photorealistic at the same time, that gives you eye-candy graphics and also doesn't strain your system too much. They managed to make the peak of what VR gaming allows. An immersing, photoreal and most importantly, actually insanely fun video game. And outside of the great work of the very talented developers at Valve, we also have to thank the infinite pile of money that allowed them to spend all these years refining Half-Life Alyx to be the most polished VR game, if not simply the most polished game ever. I could glaze Half-Life Alyx for another hour, but let's cut to the chase. How exactly could a good game releasing hurt a genre? As I mentioned before, game studios usually make games for profit. That is just part of the capitalistic system we live in. Is it perfect? No. It's the opposite actually. It encourages the fast release of slop battle pass microtransaction games to make a quick buck that is then used to make the next slop game. It's why so many games that release require you to use future graphics cards as minimum requirements. As long as the trailer looks good and gets enough pre-purchases, it's not worth it to spend the extra time and money to optimize a game to actually run on your computer. If you bought it already, it's already done. It's pure min-maxing logic, whatever makes the most money. All this is the same reason VR never took off much. During the gold rush in late 2017, early 2018, we sure had some companies releasing VR titles, or at least adding VR support to existing games. There was actually potential for profit then, as the market seemed to be growing and people were looking for VR games to play. Game studios all wanted a slice of that money pie. Ever since then, this slowed down to a halt, with only indie developers remaining, as those usually focus on making a great game and have capitalistic success as their secondary goal. Basically, indie developers don't have to worry about time, because they don't have the success of an entire company weighing down on them. But since they aren't part of any game company by definition and aren't focused on capitalistic intents, they also lack the money to make something on the scale of a AAA game. Game studios, however, have the funds, but they lack the time to make a good VR game, since a game that flops may just put their studio at the brink of bankruptcy. So why risk making a VR game that has a high chance of not making a profit when you can make a guaranteed profit Battle Royale slop shooter number 25?
And I'm tired of playing the same Call of Duty every year. Splitgate Battle Royale launches free right now, and it's f***ing awesome.
And thus we come back to the cherry on top that came a few years later when Half-Life Alyx released. While most people and potential game studios started working on VR games in 2017 or so, Valve not only started years earlier, but also had the backing of an infinite pile of money. Thus, they had no worries about time or money to release. They effectively had the combined advantages of game studios and indie developers. Valve basically is an indie development studio with money. Half-Life Alyx has thus unintentionally raised the bar of VR titles so astronomically high that no indie developer or game company even dares to try. Because why release something when you know it is impossible to escape the shadow of Half-Life Alyx? I think Valve expected the opposite to happen, and many may agree that a good game releasing should inspire people to create something just as great. After all, aren't we all passionate about something because someone else made something great before us? But time has shown that this simply didn't happen. Not that I think it should demotivate people, but it ultimately did. There are evidently few VR games releasing, and sure, there are still some indie developers working on their VR titles. After all, they are majorly driven by passion. But the chance of a game studio making a VR title is now lower than ever, since it's not only not worth the money and time, you are now also competing with what Half-Life Alyx did all those years ago. Valve leapfrogged every VR developer. You would need at least a decade to catch up to Half-Life Alyx if you had an infinite pool of money backing you and a team of talented developers like those at Valve. It is through all these circumstances that Valve unintentionally did the very thing it tried to prevent, which is killing, or at least majorly halting, VR gaming. The fallout of Half-Life Alyx was a surge in Valve Index sales that stopped once the Meta Quest headsets released. While the quality of a Valve Index is superior, and those truly passionate about VR will get it instead, MetaQuest headsets come at a fraction of the price, making it much more available to the casual gamer. And as much as I hate and will critique Facebook, Meta and Mark Zuckerberg for basically every single one of their products and their practices, they were the life raft that VR gaming needed in its last dying breath. They fund indie developers to make new VR titles, but then also force them to be MetaQuest exclusive. Meta of course also released a nightmare-inducing metaverse, but that's neither here nor there. As we're standing currently with VR, Meta is dominating the market and essentially has a monopoly on it. The MetaQuest headsets are affordable and easily set up, as scummy as the company behind them is. Nowadays, the only reason people buy a VR headset anymore is to play VR chat, or to occasionally play one of the few main VR games that exist, out of which most are arena-style fight simulators, which are all pretty fun, I will admit. As for the future of VR, we may just be on the verge of getting out of the no games rut. Meta has taken over the market, and trends seem to indicate that cheap, standalone VR headsets with AR capabilities are the future, which is exactly what Meta is offering already. The price seems to be the most important point though. It's the reason the Apple Vision Pro immediately disappeared again. It was simply too expensive. Valve themselves are working on the Deckard VR headset, which will likely be standalone and hopefully will be cheap enough for people to be ready to buy it. The $300 MetaQuest is insanely hard to beat, but if I trust anyone, it is infinite money pile Valve. Most analysts actually show an upward trend for VR headsets, even if sales are mostly slightly down as of the making of this video. The only downside this current trend is indicating is that we may not be getting another Half-Life Alyx anytime soon, as that is a game that requires a great amount of processing power, far more than what a MetaQuest 3 is capable of on its own, and same will probably go for the Deckard. And if game developers are focusing on VR, which is already a small market, they will rather focus on the market of standalone VR headsets, as that is a way larger one, which means cheaper graphic, tech demo-like games. I for one am glad that VR seemingly still has a place in gaming, even if it's at the cost of Meta owning that market. I can still remember the Christmas of 2017 when I finally got my VR headset after years of wishing for one, and immediately booted up a Steam VR testing ground and flew up as high as I could using a jetpack to then drop down again. VR has the potential to do magical things, and I wish I could gift everyone on the planet that feeling once. And the $300 MetaQuest 3S may be as close to that as it can get. The idea of virtual reality fizzling out like it's nothing just because it isn't profitable for game studios is one of the greatest shames imaginable. And perhaps we are at the brink of a market that makes it profitable enough for game developers again. I hate capitalism. Until then, we have to give a shout out to the indie developers that have still been making games for all this time. And unfortunately, I gotta hand it to Meta for funding games, like Asgard's Wrath 2, which is by all means a AAA VR game that released only 2 years ago. And most importantly, I also want to shout out modders that keep adding VR capabilities to more and more games. You guys know I love the modders, and this is just one more reason as to why. And also shout out to the furry community for keeping the scene alive using VR chat. By all accounts, I don't think VR is dying just yet, and I can only hope for the future that another game will blow me away like Half-Life Alyx did. It may take a bit until we get there, but I'll gladly wait. And otherwise, thank you for watching.